Do we have to do this today? Can we wait and come back next week?
No, I know you. If we wait until next weekend, it'll be like 6 months before I even get you this far again. Okay. Let's go in.
Fine. What are you waiting for?
I hate the way they stand there and wait for you to come in.
Yes, and the big handshake, and they greet you like they've known you forever.
We've saved a seat for you.
How long have you been looking? Where else have you gone?
We've got something special for the kiddies today. We're gonna give them lots of candy and things that make a joyous noise.
You know, I liked the guy we had a few weeks ago.
What guy? I don't remember.
The guy with the jeans.
Oh, and all the tattoos? No!
Oh, come on, I felt a connection with him. It felt like he knew exactly why I was there.
That guy went on forever. I thought he would never finish.
See, I was okay with him until he got to the part about the money. I mean, it's always about the money.
Honey, we are not alone.
Right. Sorry.
That's why we're here. All right, let's try one more time. Let's do it for the kids.
For the kids. We're here now anyway, so we may as well go in for our free cup of coffee.
Shalom, everybody. God bless you, and thank you so very much for joining us for our Father's Wednesday night Bible study. I'm Pastor Scott Velain with Holy Impact Ministries, and I just want to say welcome, welcome, welcome to everybody out there. We certainly do appreciate you, and we want to say welcome to everybody at Facebook, everybody at Rumble, everybody at Odyssey, everybody at the Holy Impact Ministries website, wherever it is that you might be watching this particular video from. We just want to say welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for sharing your time with us. We've got a lot going on this evening concerning Deuteronomy chapter 25 and some maybe not so miscellaneous laws that Jehovah God is once again reminding the house of Israel through the auspices of Moses. And Moses, once again, is getting ready to pass away. He's getting ready to hand the mantle down to Joshua, and he is going through all of these different laws and commandments and precepts and feast days and appointments and all of these things to help remind the house of Israel what they've already been taught. And so Moses is just kind of sharpening the spear, if you will, before he goes, and trying to prepare the house of Israel for a time that he is not going to be with them any longer. And so That's what we're looking at this evening in Deuteronomy chapter 25. We're going to be talking about all kinds of miscellaneous laws. You might want to stay tuned because some of these might really interest you. Before we do that, though, once again, I hope and pray that everybody had a wonderful Mother's Day weekend this weekend. It was a busy, busy time for us. We had a lot to do, and we were preparing for and updating equipment in the studio for the podcast every morning. Again, for those of you who don't know, we have a live podcast every Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I want to thank so many of you for coming and joining me at 8 o'clock in the morning. I know that's pretty early for some folks, but it is really a blessing to see people from our congregation there in the chat rooms. And I just want to say thank you so very, very much for doing that and for leaving comments as well and words of encouragement. They really do mean quite a lot. And so we want to say thank you for that. Again, the podcast going very, very well, and you can check us out there on Spreaker, which is where we broadcast live from in the morning, and also we broadcast video live as well, not just the podcast itself, but we also podcast in video format as well on the Velain Report, on our Velain Report YouTube channel. So you won't be able to find that at the Holy Impact Ministries YouTube channel. You have to go to the Velain Report YouTube channel to find that, or you can also find us on Rumble at the Velain Report there as well. We are putting them up on Facebook under the Holy Impact Ministries Facebook channel. So if you want to see the live podcast in video format on Facebook, you have to look for Holy Impact Ministries, and you'll find it there. It's listed there. So there is that. But I just wanted to say thank you so very much for your kind words and your of encouragement and the support for the Velain Report. We are still looking for sponsors for that. So don't forget to share that video. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to, again, favorite it if you are using a podcast application. We appreciate that very, very much. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break here for just a couple of minutes, and we are going to move right into our study into Deuteronomy chapter 25. Stay with us. We'll be right back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back, everybody. And once again, before we get started here this evening, I just want to say welcome and thank you for sharing your time with us as we continue our examination into the book of Deuteronomy this evening, which is once again the last book of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, for those of you who don't already know that. Here in the 25th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to read about several different miscellaneous laws that may seem insignificant, but it's important to understand that each one of these commandments has to do with the decentralized control of land through family ownership, which were basic to the Israelite economy. What's interesting about the commandment of Jehovah God that we find here in the book of Deuteronomy, and literally all throughout the Torah, I might add, is the fact that the land that Jehovah God was giving to the Israelites remained God's land. Even though God was giving this particular land to the descendants of Abraham to live in and to harvest and to be fruitful in and to multiply in, that land still belonged to Jehovah God. And this is exactly why Jehovah God commanded the house of Israel not to divide the land or to sell that land off to other nations. Jehovah God knew that if he allowed the house of Israel to squander that land among the nations, his people would indeed be scattered. And this is not what Jehovah God originally intended or wanted. Our Father in heaven wanted the house of Israel to be together and to live together and to work together in one place, in a land of milk and honey, where he could be their God and they could be his people. And he knew that he could not complete or achieve that objective if his people were scattered all throughout the nation. And therefore, Jehovah God made it very clear to the house of Israel that the land belonged to him, and that the land he was giving them to live in was not to be sold or to be divided amongst the nations of the world. And I want us to read that in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 23 and 24. So let's go take a look at that very quickly here. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 23 and 24 says this. It says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land." So in other words, a redemption of the land meant that you were to take that land back. And that's what, again, Jubilee was all about. When everything went back to the original owner. After 7 years, you had this point of time when everything went back. So if you sold the land to someone, whether he was a foreigner or not, it was under the understanding that when that land was done being harvested, or when that seventh year came back around, that land would go back to that Israelite. Again, the land did not belong to the Israelites. It was given to them by Jehovah God to live in, but the land was still God's. And God says, you shall not sell the land, in other words, in perpetuity, in other words, forever, to someone. You don't sell the land off. You're not allowed to do that. And so we talked a little bit about this during our podcast this week, in fact. And so you might want to listen to that as well. I think the title of that particular episode was The Sin of the Nation of Israel. But you might want to listen to that. But it was very important to our Father in heaven that the house of Israel did not divide or sell the land to outside nations, because our Father in heaven had plans for that land and that destination that he would indeed bring all of his children back into at the end of the age. And we can read about that in many places throughout the Bible. One of them is Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 28. Let's read that as well here this evening. Again, Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 28 says this. Jehovah God says, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart and a new spirit, and I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. And therefore, as we read down through Deuteronomy chapter 25, and we read about all of these miscellaneous laws and commandments that our Father in heaven has laid out before the Israelites, it's important that we understand that these miscellaneous laws and commandments were indeed in order to keep peace within the assembly of the house of Israel, and in order to keep that land clean. And we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. You know, there were certain laws about how a man could be punished and how a man could not be punished. There were certain laws about how women were to be treated and how men were to be treated by one another. There were laws about having fair weights and fair balances when engaging in commerce. Keeping all of this in mind, we need to remember that once again Moses is about to pass away, and he's about to pass the mantle on to Joshua. And it was because of this that Moses was once again preparing the house of Israel to enter into the promised land that Jehovah God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them. And so it's also important to remember that when people sin, the land that they are living in becomes polluted in the eyes of Jehovah God. When the house of Israel does not keep the seventh-day Sabbath of Jehovah God, the land becomes polluted. And when there is fornication and sexual immorality in the land becomes polluted. And I'd like us to read that in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 through 25. So let's read that as well. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 and 25 says this: "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." And therefore, all of these miscellaneous laws that were commanded by our Father in heaven were what kept the land from vomiting out its inhabitants. And that's something that we as modern-day Christians today need to keep in mind, considering the land that we live in today in our time. The more bloodshed, the more violence, the more sexual immorality, the more injustice that is done, and the more the land becomes polluted. And just as we're told here in the 18th chapter of the book of Leviticus, the land will indeed eventually vomit out its inhabitants, and Jehovah God will indeed see to it that it does. Keeping all of these things in mind, I'd like for us to open the books this evening to Deuteronomy chapter 25 so that we can read down through the 25th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy and know exactly what it says, and just as importantly, what it does not say. Let's take a look at that very quickly here. And again, we're going to go over to eastward this evening. And I just want to read down through Deuteronomy chapter 25. Not very long chapter. So let's go ahead and just read through it here. Deuteronomy chapter 25 begins verse 1. It says, if there is a dispute between men and they come out to court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but not more, lest, if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go to the gate and to the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And he shall answer and say, So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. When men fight with one another, and the wife of one man draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. You shall not have in your bag 2 kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house 2 kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have, a full and fair measure you shall have. that your days may be long in the land that Yahovah your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to Yahovah your God. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when Yahovah your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that Yahovah your God is giving you for inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. And that is the 25th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And there's a little bit to unpack here. You might have noticed some strange, what might seem strange, miscellaneous laws to you. One of the first things that we see here in Deuteronomy chapter 25 is the commandment of how a guilty man should be disciplined and how a guilty man should not be disciplined. It's important to remember that there were no prisoners during the days of Moses. No one was thrown into a hole in the ground or into a jail cell or was ever incarcerated the way that we do today. If a crime had been committed and the commandment of Yahovah God had been transgressed, judgment came swiftly, and it was executed swiftly, and it was done immediately, and it was taken care of, and then you went about your business. There was no supporting people in jail back in Moses' day. People were disciplined immediately, and they were corrected, and then they were sent back into society as the crime, as long as the crime was not that grievous. And it's important to understand Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, where we are told that only 40 stripes were to be given to an Israelite and no more. Why was that? Only 40 stripes were allowed to be given because anything more than that degraded your brother in your sight. Even though someone may have committed a crime, that did not mean that person was to be publicly degraded. He was to suffer the consequences of his crime, and then he was to be set back on his feet and put back into the community. And therefore, the beating of a man for his crime was far better than incarcerating or imprisoning a man that you now have to support. And once again, I don't think that we have to be rocket scientists to see the benefit of this kind of retribution and this kind of punishment versus what we do today, and just dragging it out forever and then having to support these guys in prison. Far fewer people would commit crimes if they knew that they were going to get a good beating for committing those crimes. And far less taxpayer money would be spent on supporting those in prison for months upon months upon months on end. The criminal was punished, he paid his debt to society right then and right there, and then he was released back into society so that he could become a productive member of the assembly, which is far better than the prison system that we have today in our time. And another very quick, almost minuscule commandment is found in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, where it is written that you shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. What does this mean? It just seems very minuscule, and it's just really quick. There's one sentence, one verse here. What does this mean? You shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out grain. In order to gain a proper perspective on exactly what this particular commandment pertains to, I'd like to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and I'd like to read verses 7 through 15. So let's do that. We're going to go over here to eastward here, and we're going to jump up to the New Testament. And I just want to start in verse 7 here, and I want to read down through to verse 15. It says this: Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of the Messiah. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Paul says, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. Now, many people will take this scripture out of context, and because they don't read the whole Bible, they just read this. This is all they read. This is all they know. They cherry pick things, and they don't understand what Paul is saying here. But I want us to pay close attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 14. He tells us, in the same way that you do not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Who proclaims that? The Lord commanded that. Here in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is teaching the assembly in Corinth why it is written, you shall not muzzle the ox when it treads out the grain. Paul tells the assembly in Corinth that it was written for their sake that the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher should thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. What does that mean? It means that in exactly the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Those who preach and teach the gospel are the ox that tread out the grain. Those who preach and teach the gospel are the plowmen who plow in hope and thresh in the thresher's hope of sharing in the crop. No man or woman can effectively teach and preach the gospel message of Yahovah God without support of the assembly. Without the support of the assembly, the ox has nothing to eat, and the plowman no longer shares in the crop, which is, once again, against the will of Yahovah God. It should be clear to us that the Apostle Paul robbed other churches in order to support the assembly at Corinth, because the assembly or the church at Corinth was clearly a poor church. It was a poor assembly. They were poor. They were destitute. And this is why the Apostle Paul robbed from other churches in order to support the assembly in Corinth. Again, we can read that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 7 through 9. Let's read that very quickly. Important scripture for us to know and to understand what's going on here. What does Paul say? 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7. He says, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you, and when I was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. And so once again, my friends, it wasn't that Paul was not getting paid for preaching the gospel, because he was. He was robbing other churches. He tells us right here, in order to support himself so that he could serve the assembly in Corinth. Okay? And it's important that we understand this. And yes, Paul was a tent maker. When he came to a poor church, he didn't charge the church anything because they were poor. They were destitute. They didn't have anything to give him. And so he robbed other churches to support himself so that he could serve the more poor churches. And sometimes he had to work as a tent maker to make a little bit of extra money as well, until that money got to him from the other churches. And just like he tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9, the brothers came from Macedonia, they supplied his need. Okay, so I want us to know and understand what this is all about, and the fact that, yes, the Apostle Paul did make his living by the gospel. Again, he didn't accept anything from this particular assembly because this particular assembly obviously was poor and it was destitute. And so he wasn't going to trouble this assembly for that reason. But he did take from other churches in order to support himself, in order to serve this one. Okay? According to the Bible. Not says I, but says our God-breathed scripture. Once again, just because the Apostle Paul didn't receive donations and offerings from the assembly at Corinth does not mean that the Apostle Paul did not receive donations and offerings from other churches and from the brothers who came from Macedonia. Today in our time, there are far too many puffed up and prideful, self-righteous so-called Christians, and even those who are not Christians, who look down on a pastor or a man of God who preaches the gospel, thinking that the pastor or the man of God lives off of donations. But the truth of the matter is that the man of God works twice as hard than most people for the meager payment that he receives. And the payment that the pastor receives is indeed owed to him by the assembly. It's not a handout. It's not a charity. It's not like giving a dog a scrap from the table in the eyes of Yahuwah God. Yahuwah God expects the assembly to support that man of God that is feeding them. It is commanded within the spoken word of Yahuwah God that he who preaches the gospel is to make his living by the gospel, and when the man of God does not make his living by the gospel, the assembly falls short of keeping the commandment of Yahuwah God. And make no mistake about it, my friends, that assembly will indeed be held accountable on the day of judgment. The man of God who preaches the gospel is not looking for a handout. The man of God who preaches the gospel is looking for what is due him according to the commandment of God. And it's important for us all to know this and to understand this. And therefore, it's important that those who are being fed by a man of God who is teaching and preaching the gospel and treading out the grain should make sure that the man of God who is treading out that grain is also able to make a living for himself and for his family. Not says I, but says our God-breathed scripture. And I tell you the truth, my friends, far too many people are going to be called into judgment for not keeping this particular commandment. Moving forward, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, the concept of a brother taking on his brother's wife as his own responsibility. Now, once again, all of this has to do with the assembly doing what is right and what is just in the eyes of God. And it has to do with the what we call today the nuclear family that Yahuwah God created. The family was so vitally important. It was a vitally important concept in the days of Moses and from the very beginning. It was God's will that if a man died, his brother should take care of his wife and his children. And if that man didn't have a son, then his brother was to go into that woman, and she was to have a son, and that son was to carry on his dead father's name. And that was love. That was the family. It was an obligation that the man had. And again, as we see in Deuteronomy chapter 25, if that brother did not take care of his brother's wife and did not give to her a child that she could name in her deceased husband's name, that man was humiliated and disgraced in front of everyone at the gate of the city. And that woman was to spit in his face and pull off his sandal. And this was a humiliating thing that would take place. And it was also seen to it that the land that was given to that man would go to his brother as well. And that that brother who had died would be survived by his brother, who would continue to have children by his wife in the name of that brother who had died. Again, this kept the family unit together, and it kept it moving forward. Now, I know that this is a much different concept than what we're used to today in our time. Today in our time, people behave like dogs out in a field, trading partners like they change underwear on a daily basis. But that was not so in the beginning, and it shouldn't be so today. In the beginning, a woman knew what her objective and her main purpose in life was, and that objective and that purpose was to have children and to further the family line and the lineage of the house of Israel. And the man knew that his objective, what his objective was, and that which was to share his seed and to fertilize that woman in order to be fruitful and to multiply as the commandment of Jehovah God had required. The sexual relationship between a man and a woman in the beginning was a very special and a very sacred thing. A sexual relationship between a man and a woman meant something back then. A sexual relationship literally welded a man together with a woman, and they literally became one flesh in the eyes of Jehovah God. A sexual relationship consummated a marriage between a man and a woman, and therefore, once again, it was a sacred event that signaled and sanctified and ordained a marriage between a man and a woman. And although the sacred sanctity of and the consummation of a marriage has been lost, all but lost today in our time, it's important to remember and to reestablish this very sacred event that occurs between one man and one woman as far as true God-fearing, Messiah-following, cross-bearing Christians are concerned. Now, people that I talk to who do not read the Bible for themselves will oftentimes point the finger at those who do read the Bible for themselves, and they'll proclaim that we're going backwards and not forwards because we're holding to the old ways of God and not the new ways of the church. And to them I say, ring the bell, send up the flares, strike up the band, because they're absolutely right, and they should win a prize. We are holding to the old ways of God and not the new ways of the church, because we are wise enough to know the difference between the ways of Jehovah God and the ways of the pagan apostate church today. It is because we read the Bible that we know when the true seventh-day Sabbath of God is. It is because we read the Bible that we know that the anniversary of the death of our Messiah was not on some Roman Catholic-created Good Friday, but on Passover Day. It is because we read the Bible that we know that the Roman Catholic-created pagan Easter Sunday morning does not exist within the confines of the Bible. It is because we read the Bible that we know that the Roman Catholic-created Christmas festival is nothing but a man-made sinful circus that has been created to mock the very birth of the Lamb of God. And it is because we read the Bible that we know that sex is not a toy. The sexual relationship between one man and one woman is a wedding gift from Jehovah God that ordains and sanctifies that marriage between one man and one woman. And the basic purpose of that sexual relationship was to be fruitful and to multiply, not to be treated as some kind of fleshly addiction. Once again, the family unit was greatly exalted in the beginning, and it should be greatly exalted to this very day in our time as well. As much as the liberal leftist agenda would love to destroy the nuclear family that was created by Jehovah God himself, we as modern-day Christians should be wise enough to see by now what happens when the family is disintegrated and degraded and brought to nothing. Which brings us down to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 through 12, where it is written that if a man gets into a fight with another man, a woman is not to in any way, shape, or form do damage to the plumbing of another man, to put it kindly. Once again, the seed of a man is meant to carry on that man's legacy. The seed of a man is meant to expand the house of Israel, and therefore the seed of a man was not to be attacked by anyone for any reason. And it's important to realize this is not the only commandment that has to do with hitting or striking another human being. There are other laws concerning these things. We just don't see it here in the 25th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. This commandment was not just exclusive to women. And it's important for us to understand that. Let's turn very quickly to Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 through 25. Again, this commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 25 reminds the house of Israel of everything else that Moses has taught them. So let's go back to Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 through 25 here very quickly. And I just want to read this for you so that you can understand. This is not the only law that has to do with striking another human being or doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 through 25 says this: When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. As we can see here in the 21st chapter of the book of Exodus, there were also laws concerning men who struck females, or people who struck slaves, or a man who struck a pregnant woman. And therefore, the commandment concerning fighting or striking one another went much deeper than what we simply read here in Deuteronomy chapter 25, which brings us down to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 13 through 16, which talks about not having two different kinds of weights. In other words, your weights and your balances should be fair and balanced. A full and fair weight shall you have. A full and fair measure shall you have. And those who do not have clear weights and measures, and who act dishonestly, they are an abomination to Yahovah God. And so that's a pretty simple one there. I don't think we have to really touch on that too very, very much. And finally, at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19, Moses once again reminds the house of Israel about Amalek. Amalek, who Yahovah God said would be a perpetual enemy of the house of Israel back in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. So Moses is once again reminding the house of Israel that this Amalek, the Amalekites, are to be wiped off the face of the earth. Okay, let's go read that very quickly in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. And we're going to just jump right down here back into the book of Exodus here. And we just want to read Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. It says this: Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Now, this is when Israel was passing through the wilderness, trying to get to the promised land. They run into Amalek, right? And Amalek wants to make war with them, okay? So that's what this is about in Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. It says, Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and they put under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then Yahovah said to Moses, Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called it, In the name of Yahovah is my banner, saying, A hand upon the throne of Yahovah. Yahovah will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. And so once again, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19, Moses reminds the house of Israel of God's commandment to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Amalek was the grandson of Esau and the great-grandson of Abram. Saul, who was the first king of Israel, was commanded by God to destroy the Amalekites as a form of divine retribution for their actions against the Israelites during their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land in 1 Samuel chapter 15. However, Saul didn't listen to Yahovah God, and he spared the Amalekite king and some of their livestock, which ultimately led to the downfall of King Saul. Keeping all of this in mind, this is one of the reasons why the house of Israel today has so many enemies surrounding them. And that is another story that we don't have time for here this evening, other than to say that once again, when we do not obey the commandment of Yahuwah God, there are always consequences for not being obedient to the spoken word of Yahuwah God. And with all of that information under our belts, we are now ready to move into Deuteronomy chapter 26, which we will do next Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we get into the offerings of first fruits and tithe. But until that point in time, I will once again do as I always do and ask everyone within the sound of my voice to please take what you have heard here this evening to your own prayer closet. Bow your head and bend your knee and face the holy promised land of Jerusalem and ask in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach if what you have heard here this evening be true or not. Ask, seek, and knock on his door and on his door alone, so that the proper door can be opened unto you. And if you will do that, and if you will stay the course to the end, you and I will surely walk through the gates of his soon coming kingdom together. Once again, everybody, thank you so very much for sharing your time with me here. It is such a blessing to walk through the Torah. You know, we're getting down towards the end of the Torah, which again is the first 5 books of the Bible. And it has been such a journey. It has really been such an eye-opening journey, I think, for all of us, and for so many people who are still contacting me and still wanting to download the PDF files from the book of Genesis and Exodus and those things. And I am so thrilled with that, you know, that people are still downloading those PDF files, still listening to those videos, still hammering things out, reading the book for themselves, cross-referencing things. This is what this ministry has always been about, is encouraging each and every real, true, God-fearing, Messiah-following, cross-bearing Christian to read that book for themselves, and not to just listen to somebody tell them what it says, but to read it for themselves and ask him what he says. That's important, my friends, and my hope and my prayer is that when we finally get to where we're going, he will look at us and say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." With that being said, everybody, we're going to just say a quick prayer over everybody this week so that we can ask for a blessing for the week. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, we pray. Father, blessed and holy is your name, high and far above all name. We thank you, Father, for your mercy and for your grace, as always. We thank you for these precious scriptures that we have and the truth of your word that we have to, once again, lead us and guide us through this maze of evil days that we are now living in. We thank you for giving us that full armor that the Apostle Paul talks about in the 6th chapter of the book of Ephesians. And we thank you, Messiah Yeshua, for not leaving us as orphans. We thank you for being with us. We thank you for still this very day answering our prayers. We thank you for this navigation system that we have to be able to endure to the end and to once again conquer over evil as you have commanded us to do. We thank you for helping us to be the light of the world that we are supposed to be and the salt of the earth. And we pray, Father, that you would give us an extra amount of saltiness, that you would give us an extra amount of your spirit within us, that we may have it to be as tenacious as you were and to stand in these evil days that we are now in. Help us to know when to speak and when to be silent, when to stand and when to sit. Help us to know where to turn and when to turn to the right and when to turn to the left. Help us, in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, to continue to spread your gospel message that we may expand your soon coming kingdom. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, we ask for your blessing this week. Once again, everybody, thank you so very much. I appreciate you, and I will see you this next coming Friday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then we'll see you again for another installment into the book of Mark this coming Saturday. Remember, Pentecost is just around the corner, also known as Shavuot, and we'll be talking about that as well. So we got a lot going on here towards the end of the week. Again, 21st of June is the first day of summer. Summer is finally here, and we still have a lot of work to do, my friends. So once again, everybody, God bless you, and have a wonderful, wonderful week. Until next time.